Welcome to the Transformative Play Initiative. We're going to be talking today about experimental LARP, live action role-playing games, design basics. So our agenda for today, we're going to go over a review of traditional LARP, and this is a second part of a two-part series, so I do recommend watching the first part in order to have context for this one. We're going to go into the emergence of what we're calling experimental LARP, and we'll get into what that means in a second. We'll talk about collaborative LARP, which includes Nordic LARP, Blockbuster Larps. We'll be looking specifically at New World Magischola and mechanics within it. We'll look at collaborative style White Wolf LARPs, and we'll be looking at the mechanics for end of the line as an example. And we'll be discussing Nordic Freeform, and a type of Nordic Freeform called Jeepform and the design constraints that are placed upon Jeepform LARPs. And then we'll talk about black box LARP and game design in a black box LARP called White Death. And then we'll have some takeaways. So a review of traditional LARP. What traditional LARP, quote unquote, is depends upon a player's context and experience. So one person's tradition may look very experimental to another and vice versa. For our purposes, a traditional LARP includes some or all of the following. It can emerge as a LARP version of a traditional tabletop role-playing game, such as Dungeons and Dragons, World of Darkness, and Call of Cthulhu. It often features a fantastical genre setting, such as fantasy, science fiction, or post-apocalyptic. It may feature campaign-style play, including long-running games with consistent characters, or it may create a new setting, but rely heavily on traditional formats of play. It has some way to represent or enact physical combat with win and lose conditions. It has mechanics that players should learn and are expected to represent accurately. These mechanics will limit players' agency in order to preserve order and fairness. It features rulebooks and setting lore that are sometimes quite extensive. It imposes secrecy of character motivations and plot, and possessing knowledge outside of what a character discovers through play may be considered metagaming. It often requires officiation by an organizer similar to a referee, and/or it often requires storytelling by an organizer to reveal plot as it unfolds and guide players through adventures. And as we mentioned before, your mileage may vary depending on the LARP, but these are some of the facets of traditional LARPs. So the emergence of experimental LARP. So attempts at defining alternative LARPs and their communities often fail. Creators will often design their next game to further subvert existing definitions or expectations. So the minute you lay any sort of definition on something, people will do the opposite. So even slight deviations from existing norms may feel experimental in traditional LARP communities. So changing a rule book, for example. So it depends on your context, what is considered experimental. And then sometimes LARPs that start out as an experiment wildly different than traditional LARP become a tradition that gets replicated in other places. So for example, you'll hear the term the Nordic LARP tradition, which actually means many different things, as we'll see. However, the term Nordic LARP is highly debated and is defined differently depending on who you ask and their context. So what becomes traditional often, again, depends on specific contexts of play. Sometimes experimental LARPs from specific designers become their own genre or tradition. An example of this is Ninaform, based on LARPs by Nina Runa Essendrop, and we'll talk about one of those today. So we're using experimental here as a catch-all term for LARPs that emphasize design practices that were experimental or avant-garde at the time of their emergence. Experimental often means a focus on games that attempt to subvert existing norms to encourage new types of design and play experiences. And it may refer to games that are designed completely outside of existing traditions. For example, LARPs emerging from the art and theater world without any exposure to Dungeons and Dragons. So despite the popularity of traditional settings, themes, tropes, and activities, LARPs can be about basically anything within the human experience and beyond. So anything that we can imagine, we can actually make a LARP about. I've been in LARPs where people play rocks, where they play animals, where they play abandoned toys, stars in the universe that represent David Bowie songs, fragments of the same person's consciousness, all battling with one another or discussing things. So the sky's the limit, and no pun intended, in terms of what we can imagine. So experimental LARPs play with the form in interesting ways. They are often bespoke, meaning that they're created for that one specific aesthetic goal and purpose. And sometimes those LARPs are never to be played again outside of that context. Other times there may be what are called reruns, where that same LARP is run again in a different context, but with the same bespoke design. They often feature a collaborative style of play, which we'll go into in more depth, emphasizing off-game consent instead of conflict resolution mechanics. So if you've watched the tabletop and LARP videos, the traditional ones, we go into a lot of mechanics, and that often is de-emphasized in experimental LARPs. There could be, for example, exceptionally abstract experiences that happen in a black box with almost no setting or costuming, which we'll discuss in a second. And there are often LARPs with socially realistic settings that feature existing conflicts within our world without any win conditions. So this is not about escapism or escaping into a fantasy world, which also can have very serious themes, but it's about actually playing things within our world. There are a lot of LARPs like this within the experimental tradition. Sometimes we call this playing to lose, or what's called type 2 fun, which means that it's not fun in the sense of in the moment you're having fun, but upon reflection, it's a rewarding experience. There are often LARPs that push the boundaries of what is socially acceptable behavior through this alibi of play, the alibi of the character and of the fiction. And that can incentivize wild exploration of behavior in a safer container of play. No container is ever fully safe, but it can feel safer in the way that it is established in the play group. And then there are LARPs that push the physical limits of the players in extreme ways, such as pushing boundaries of physical exertion and deprivation of sleep or food or other such things that are needed. And there's also LARPs that push psychological boundaries, featuring emotionally challenging scenarios focused on oppression, abuse, grief, relationship dramas, all sorts of other kinds of situations that can happen. So experimental LARPs often play with the form in very interesting ways. So there are LARPs that take existing genres and or traditional role-playing games, as we've seen, and offer experimental forms of play, expanding what play can actually mean for these groups that are embedded in these traditions. So for example, LARPs with highly realistic physical environments and no representational mechanics, even within a certain genre. And this can be called What You See Is What You Get, or WYSIWYG. It can also be called 360-degree immersion. And by immersion here, I mean immersion into the environment. It feels like a very immersive physical space, and that helps people get into the fiction of the game. Other examples include LARPs that are in traditional settings that are played in highly desirable tourist locations, which we will discuss later. There are LARPs that have representational mechanics, but they have consent-based rules rather than this emphasis on fairness and some mechanical representations of who wins and who loses, and some sort of like randomizer. And then there are LARPs that are traditionally played without an emphasis on touch that then get played as a visceral embodied experience. And we'll talk about that in a moment as well. There can be LARPs where several players play the same character, rotating each scene. There are LARPs where people reveal the interiority of their characters' thoughts and feelings through meta techniques, for example, monologuing, which we'll talk about later. There are LARPs with full transparency and no secrets, or hiding information from each other. There are LARPs that feature nonlinear time or unreliable narrators, where you can't necessarily trust what's being presented to you in the fiction. There are LARPs without game masters or facilitators. There are nano games that are meant to be played in short amounts of time, like 5 minutes to an hour. And there are LARPs that feature experimental new technologies, multimedia storylines, etc., and many, many more. So there's a lot of different experimentation going on. I just wanted to emphasize here, experimental does not mean quote unquote better. It just means different. So everybody's play style is valid. Everybody's style of LARP that they engage in is valid. Everybody's fun is the same. The idea here is that there are certain people that have found, for whatever reason, traditional LARPs unsatisfying and have decided to innovate the form in some way. And that may work for some people and not for others. Okay, so we're first going to talk about what I term collaborative LARP, because it seems to be the most descriptive of what we're actually talking about. It's often called emergent LARP, sometimes in the US. It's called Nordic or Nordic inspired LARP in certain places. These terms can get very confusing because, for example, Nordic LARP does not necessarily refer to all LARPs within the Nordic countries. And Nordic LARP can refer to many different styles of LARP. So it can get a little confusing. But by collaborative LARP, I'm going to say here that it often contains a collaborative instead of competitive style of play, an emphasis on creating a shared narrative together, so similar to story games in tabletop, playing for drama or playing for the story, or playing to lift other people up, or playing to lose. So it doesn't mean you can't have character wins in the game, but it means that the emphasis should be playing for what is interesting for other people and for yourself, rather than just trying to succeed. There tends to be an emphasis on intense physical and emotional experiences, and often little to no conflict resolution mechanics. It may also contain a 360-degree immersion with realistic locations, props, and costumes. Of course, not all LARPs can attain a full 360-degree immersion, but some of them really go to great lengths to try to make sure there's nothing in the environment that looks outside of that fictional setting. And sometimes these settings are very socially realistic, and they have serious themes. So eroticism, oppression, suffering, that sort of thing. And that doesn't mean that these kinds of themes are not also present in traditional LARPs or in genre LARPs, but the emphasis here is on really digging deep and exploring these aspects of the human experience that are actually present and visible in our world. However, some may also engage in these same themes through a genre lens. And we're going to talk about New World Magischola today, which was a LARP that ran between 2016 and 2020. And we're going to talk about End of the Line, which had runs from 2016 to 2018. Of course, any of these LARPs may be run again, but this is sort of describing when they were most popular. For 30 excellent example LARPs in this collaborative LARP tradition, please see the Nordic LARP book. This is a very amazing piece of documentation that has beautiful pictures and descriptions and goes through a wide range of different LARPs that have been selected by Jaakko Stenros and Markus Mantala, who are scholars within this field. They also write 2 academic essays that frame the book, that give context to what the Nordic LARP tradition is as they're defining it in that particular moment. The definition changes over time, but also, how trying to understand what this art form is. Is it a form of art? Is it a game? Is it theater? What is it? There's also a book of collective wisdom on this LARP tradition called LARP Design, Creating Role-Playing Experiences. And this is from designers all over the world who've contributed to many, many articles to this book, which I highly recommend. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about Blockbuster Larps, which some of you embedded in LARP communities may have heard this term before. The term was originally coined by Marcus Montela and Eirik Fatland in 2015. And they were specifically interested in the games Monitor Celestra, which was based in Battlestar Galactica and came out in 2013, and College of Wizardry, which was based on Harry Potter and started in 2014 and has many runs since then. These are LARPs that are based upon existing IPs and are very popular as a result of that, very appealing as a result of that. They were also LARPs that were played in impressive locations, which we'll get into in a second. So the way that they describe these LARPs is LARPs that feature quote unquote brute force design. And they mention that used to just be the default for LARPs. So they're talking specifically about traditional games during this section. And what they mention that is present in these LARPs are conflicting agendas, subgroups within groups, power hierarchies, secrets, puzzles, runtime game mastering of events, surprises, and messengers. And a lot of this will sound familiar to the first video in this series about traditional LARP. And all of these things are happening at the same time. So there's lots of different plots that are happening, which can be very stimulating for players. But they also describe how these LARPs were also inspired by the Nordic LARP tradition. And there's that word again, tradition. In this case, Nordic LARP was sort of created in opposition to what a lot of the fantasy LARPs and other LARPs, vampire LARPs, were doing in that time in the Nordic countries. And instead, there's this transition from representational mechanics to 360-degree immersion to what you see is what you get. And in this case, we have remarkably immersive locations. So Monitor Celestra was played on a real destroyer ship that has become a museum, and College of Wizardry was played in a Potter-esque Polish castle. There's also this emphasis on playing to lose rather than to win, and not necessarily having mechanics as a result. And then there's breaking up the plot monopoly, as they call it, through widespread player duties. So the plot monopoly can happen in certain games where a certain group of players get plot delivered to them or happen to be at the right place at the right time. And other players do not feel like they have access to that plot line and may feel like they're missing out as a result. And instead, in these LARPs, there's lots of duties that are dispensed among the players. So for example, in College of Wizardry, the people who are running these Witchered classes for this magic school are actually players. So they have a lot of responsibility to keep the schedule and to provide experiences for other players. So definitions vary for Blockbuster LARPs now. The term has evolved and it's been used in a lot of different ways, but overall, Blockbuster LARP now refers to any LARP in a highly immersive setting with high production values that draws an international player base. And often these LARPs will cost more than typical games with travel that might be required. And this is sometimes called LARP tourism. These LARPs often have consent-based play rather than conflict resolution mechanics, but not always. So I'm going to give you an example, New World Magischola. This was a US spinoff based on the same world as College of Wizardry, run by Larp LLC. And it's a Witchered college where characters are sorted into houses. They explore various current issues through the lens of fantasy, for example, discrimination and animal rights. And it's a collaborative style LARP with consent-based play that's designed through a queer and feminist lens. And the designers refer to this design as player-centered design. And there are a couple of main features, values really, that underpin all of this design. The first is players are more important than games. So it doesn't actually matter if a character wins in a certain scenario. Player feelings and the player experience is actually more important than the game itself. And then there's this phrase, LARP, the change you want to see in the world. So this is definitely a very progressive design. They had a hugely successful Kickstarter campaign, tapping into not only existing LARPers, but also people who are very much in love with the Harry Potter franchise, even though it's been rebranded. The first run sold out in 2 minutes on Kickstarter, and 3 additional runs were added for a total of $303,000. $303,000. It was originally played in universities, and a university with a cathedral and other castle-like architecture. There have been other settings since then, but they're all fairly high production value. Some runs could be played in a series, so it's similar to campaign play. There, for example, if you played New World Magischola 1, you could then go to Yule with that same character. Then you could go to College of Wizardry, the Challenge, which had several wizard schools all converging in Poland at a specific castle. And then you could play New World Magischola 5, and your character could graduate from school. It drew players from radically different traditions and play styles, including Boffer, interactive fiction, World of Darkness. These will be familiar to you if you've watched the last videos on traditional LARP and traditional tabletop. It drew many new players, thus defining what LARP means for them. So you have a existing player base that have come from very different, in some cases, LARP traditions and are trying to learn this consent-based play with each other. And then you also have new players who don't have any preconceived notions of what LARP is. And this is their first experience, their first exposure. There are player requested plots. So instead of a plot team that's creating a bunch of content, for the most part, there may be a meta plot, but the majority of the plot is actually requested by the players. So they would go and request certain scenes, and there would be a group of NPCs that would go and enact those scenes. There's also an emphasis on safety design in this particular LARP. Extensive workshopping, safety mechanics, for example, pronoun correction mechanics. So there's a strong emphasis on acknowledging and respecting other people's, both their characters' gender identities and their players' gender identities. Consent-based play. There also was a safety team that included off-game and in-game counselors. So players that could be in the fiction and embedded, but could also step up off-game and help people. And these counselors, some of them did have a little bit of mental health or psychology training, but others did not, which could be a little confusing in terms of the name counselor. So in terms of mechanics in these College of Wizardry style games, I'm going to give an example from New World Magischola. So say one character wants to freeze another character in place with magic. There are no turns in Magischola unless collectively agreed upon, such as in a ritual, whereas you're going to do this, then you're going to do this. In this case, character 1, Jade, is practicing a freeze spell at class at Witchard College. Jade waves a wand at character 2, Opal, and exclaims, "My spell will freeze you in place, freeze-o." And this is all improvised. They just meant to telegraph their intentions to player 2. You don't have to memorize a large list of spells and use the exact right spell and the exact right incantation. Player 2 can decide if they want the skill to succeed, fail, or have unexpected consequences. And player 2 also decides, in this particular situation, they agree that the free spell work, but they also decided that Opal's arm is now frozen in place for the entire next day, because that was narratively interesting to them to play, long after Jade has released that spell. This then leads to emergent play, where other classmates discuss the situation, conclude that dark magic must be at play, and then they decide to improvise a ritual to unfreeze the arm, which they make up on the spot through improvisation. And they successfully cast away the dark magic with, 15 players all involved in this scene. And player two decides that that actually works. So player 2 can still, after all of that, decide that, nope, arm is still frozen. And importantly, no game master is present for any of this or even needed. And this is an example here of emergent play, which this can occur in many LARPs where play inspires other play. but it's especially encouraged in consent-based play. So it's a form of yes and from improvisation. And emergent play can also have unintended story consequences. Player one did not intend for their spell practice in class to become a major plot point in this particular case. But that's what happens in player-generated content often. So emergent play can often have unintended story consequences, as we just mentioned. Many players find consent-based play and player-driven plot to be empowering. They feel like they have more agency in the world. However, it's important to say that in traditional LARPs, other players maybe really enjoy being led through a particular story. So in brute force design, this style of play can feel very overwhelming for some players. So there's lots of player-driven plots. It's hard to tell what's important to follow. Maybe you want to be in 3 different places at once because there's so many things happening. It can feel overwhelming, and players may feel drawn in different directions and unsure how to proceed. And this is particularly hard for inexperienced role players in these situations. Or the person might feel socially intimidated and uncomfortable inserting themselves into scenes. And that can happen in traditional LARPs as well. But this is a style of play that is quite social, where people don't rely on mechanics to actually solve things. And also there were classes, there were ceremonies, there's an in-game dance, and there's in-game rituals, which help ground the play and give it some direction. So even if a player feels lost, they know that they have a class in 30 minutes. So maybe that's some structure that they can fall back on. All right, so an example of a collaborative style White Wolf LARP. So End of the Line by Participation Design Agency in affiliation with White Wolf, so this was a White Wolf condoned game, had runs in Helsinki, New Orleans, and Berlin. This was a one-day, one-shot Vampire the Masquerade LARP that was run in immersive locations whenever possible. So for example, in Helsinki, it was in an abandoned squat house, and in Berlin, it was in sort of an industrial setting. The setting is a rave party where vampires and mortals mingle and engage in illicit activities. So in Vampire, if you read the setting material in the tabletop in the LARP, this would be a typical quote unquote feeding scene, meaning vampires have to have a certain number of blood points, they go and they feed, and then they engage in the actual role play. So this would often not actually be acted out. This would be happening behind the scenes. All of the characters in this LARP were designed to be both predator and prey, regardless of their vampiric status. So this was not a game about vampires ruling over humans. It was about basically within humanity, whether you're a vampire or not, there being monstrous characteristics and also the potential to be preyed upon. So in this case, feeding, sexuality, and violence were acted out in an embodied, visceral way, rather than requiring on, say, rock, paper, scissors throw in order to see if it was successful. So these experiences were not quote unquote real, but they were very realistic. This is very different from many traditional vampire LARPs, particularly in the United States, where touch is actually prohibited and mechanics are used for such activities. And this is partially in order to reduce stigma around actually role-playing vampires and this fear of people getting into the occult and drinking blood for real. And there's a lot of anxiety around that in the US, moral panic around it. And so, emphasizing that this isn't real vampirism that we're acting out became important. But this more recent emergence of this collaborative style White Wolf LARP is playing a little with that boundary, but still fictional. In this case, there were pre-written characters, but there was also secrecy. And there was workshopping and debriefing with consent mechanics and an emphasis on safety. And this was especially true in later runs of the LARP as it iterated. Players were encouraged to make mistakes. such as breaking the masquerade and revealing their vampiric status. So in vampire, often any kind of mistake like that has serious consequences in traditional LARPs. The vampiric society will come down on you. You might actually lose your character. So this can lead to players being actually very conservative in the actions they take, especially in campaign play, where they've been very attached to their character that's been around forever. And so what happens is we have a lot of players that are standing around talking and not actually risking doing so many things. And this game was designed to subvert that and to get people to actually physically do things. And because it's a one shot, there's really no risk. The character is going to go away at the end. So similar in the tabletop video where we described Fiasco, this is a similar style of play, driving your character like a stolen car that you're going to abandon. And the ethos of this LARP that was conveyed to the players was, you are all good people, but you're playing horrible characters. And this gives people alibi to engage in transgressive in-game acts. And the principle here that was conveyed to the players is play for what is interesting rather than playing to win or playing to lose. So whatever is narratively interesting, just go there. And chances are it'll be interesting for other people as well. And if not, they can go play for what's interesting for themselves. So mechanics did exist in End of the Line, but they were very, very much pared down. So for example, if you wanted to entrance another person, which we discussed in the traditional tabletop video, there are no turns in End of the Line. The player will perform the action at any time. Character 1, Jade, is a neonate Toreador vampire who is able to use presence. Now, because there's secrecy, Jade doesn't actually know if the other person is a vampire or immortal, in-game or off-game. Jade wants to try to feed on Opal, who thinks she's immortal. Opal is actually a vampire. Now, normally this would cause all sorts of mechanics to then activate, where they have to have these pools that they compare, as we discussed in the LARP video, traditional LARP video. In this case, character 1 gently places their hand on the back of character 2's neck to indicate a discipline is about to be used off-game. So this is an off-game signaling system. This is not meant to be intimidating per se, but it is visceral. There is an experience of pressure on the neck. And character 1 says, "You really, really like me." And this is an off-game signal that says that presence is being used or that some sort of discipline is being used. And the action just default succeeds, no contest. However, the character, because this is consent-based play, can interpret this result any way they want, but they should role play something relevant for the next 10 minutes. So again, just make it interesting. In this case, Opal role plays not only liking Jade, but becoming obsessed with them. And even after that 10 minutes, they allow Jade to feed, and then they follow them around for the next 10 minutes, or maybe the next hour, even when the person tries to slip away. So this could be an interesting play for both parties. Then again, if Jade decides to slip away, then perhaps the player of Opal should realize that may not be interesting anymore for that particular character. So maybe switch to some other interaction. And again, no storyteller is needed here to officiate. Now, this whole sort of sequence of events could happen in a traditional vampire LARP as well. However, players have control over the outcome here, more so than they would normally, meaning that they get to decide. Nobody's telling them what's happening to their character. And there's also more control over what players can do with their bodies. And this is really important because in consent-based play, oftentimes players in traditional LARPs may not have felt like they had a lot of control over what their characters can do. They may have been, in Vampire, for example, lured into what's called a kill box, which is, a bunch of players decide to summon someone or, invite them into what they think is one sort of scene. And it turns out it's, a scene designed to kill their character. And this is all happening secretly. And that can be deeply upsetting for for players who've had their character for many years. So in this LARP, players have control over what they do with their bodies. A player could also completely avoid that situation altogether with what's called bullet time consent and or the off-game consent negotiations that came later. So in bullet time consent, players are directed to approach very slowly and from the front before attempting to touch another player. So if I'm reaching out to put my hand around someone's neck and they can see me, then they can choose to just move away, which indicates to me as a player, okay, they're not interested in that kind of scene. And then, they can leave the situation at any time. And they could also engage in a consent negotiation, meaning we could go briefly off game and say, are you comfortable with, this sort of interaction? And also embodiment in this style of play is very encouraged to give a more visceral feel of the Gothic punk atmosphere that's described in the vampire books. So a DJ was hired to spin records all night very loudly. So this feels like a rave. Players could go to the dance floor if they were seeking play. And there was actually a mechanic or meta technique where they could lock eyes with other players while dancing. And this meta technique was intended to mean that you could invite someone else to have further play. So if somebody was lost and didn't know what to do, they could always go to the dance floor. When they could just choose to dance all night too. And then the person who's locked eyes can choose to accept or reject that invitation. So even if a player decided that their character died at the end of the night, again, this is consent-based play, so nobody can force another character to die. At the end, all characters both start and end the night on the dance floor with the phrase, "the dead can dance," which is a little pun on a very popular band from the 80s and 90s. So, again, going back to this kill box situation where somebody lost their character, and that's just what happens. Instead, their character gets revived and they all enjoy the dance in this one-shot scenario. Okay, so I'd like to talk a little bit about what is called Nordic Freeform, which is distinct in some ways from American Freeform and is also very much distinct from UK Freeform, which is more akin to parlor style or theater style LARP. So Nordic Freeform was originally conceived as sort of a hybrid between LARP and tabletop. However, the term is sometimes used interchangeably with LARP, especially in international circles. And it can be played at a table or it can be partially physically enacted. There are no costumes or special locations that are needed. So oftentimes, for example, at Festival, which is a famous scenario festival, and other kinds of games are played there too, these are classrooms that are being played in. And there's an emphasis on short, impactful scenarios that are tightly designed and facilitated. And these are meant to produce a very specific type of experience. Regardless of the tone or the theme, we're going to experience, for example, as we'll see, difficulties in romantic relationships. So this is very different from that sandbox style play where everybody can kind of go and find what they're interested in within the LARP. This is instead a very tightly focused set of scenes that have a very specific goal. So Nordic Freeform tends to use meta techniques instead of mechanics. So some examples of this might be bird in the ear or bird in ear. And this is where the facilitator, and other players can do this too sometimes, they represent the inner thoughts of the character by speaking near their ear. And the players can hear these thoughts, including the player that it's supposed to be representing, but the characters cannot. So the player decides whether or not to act upon this information that they're being given. They can also choose to ignore it. And other players may use information in order to adjust the scene to get to more intensity. So the goal here is to get progressively more and more intense and immersive. There's also monologues. This is kind of similar, but the facilitator will ask a player to briefly monologue their character's inner thoughts. So, for example, they're in the middle of a scene, the player and the character are just sort of sitting there listening to somebody with a certain look on their face. And the facilitator says monologue. And so the character is actually thinking, I can't believe they just said that. I'd better keep a calm face. And that information is available only to the players, not to the characters, but some people might play upon it. And so this is what's called, revealing the interiority of the character, which is normally kept secret and private in LARP. So a version of Nordic LARP or Nordic Freeform that we're going to talk about is the Jeepform Collective. They were founded in Denmark and Sweden with additional international members. They were active in the mid to late 2000s. They are associated with Festival and other freeform scenario festivals in various Nordic countries. And sometimes Jeepform is used interchangeably with freeform, particularly in international communities that aren't super embedded in these scenes. However, Jeep is more of a brand with a specific design philosophy that the designers adhere to within this collective. So how Jeepform subverts traditional tabletop and LARP design? Bill White has gone into this extensively if you'd like to look at some of his work. There are tightly structured narratives for a specific emotional impact, as we described before. And there's often heavy facilitation from the game master. So the game master will cut quickly, will direct, and this is very much a more, you become responsive to what the scenario is asking, what the GM is asking, rather than having a ton of input into what's happening in the fiction yourself. So you're sacrificing a certain amount of agency in order to be guided through a particularly immersive experience, hopefully immersive. And the way that Thomas Wrigstad put it, who's a member of this collective, they abandoned rules, tabletop, dice, dragons in New York. And so these are some of the tropes that are very common, or the mechanics that are very common in traditional role-playing games. New York being sort of like this epic cosmopolitan space where, maybe gritty vampire fiction is happening or something like that. So instead, we're focusing on scenarios that are not fantastical, that are very close to home, and that are very personal. They also abandoned, in some cases, the linearity of time. So scenes might happen completely out of order, or there may be flashbacks or flash forwards. In some cases, as I mentioned, they abandon the interiority of the character, meaning that, we might become privy to what the character's thinking. And there's an abandoning of props and costumes. That doesn't mean that people can't use these, but that isn't the emphasis. We're not trying to create a realistic 360 illusion here. We're just trying to have an emotional experience. And this style of play embraces the psychological aspects of play as the key feature. And this includes the meta play between the players. And those things become just important as the game itself. And furthermore, there's an emphasis on designing for bleed. Emily Care-Boss coined the term bleed in 2007. She is also part of the Jeepform collective, and bleed then gets added to the Jeepform dictionary, which is a list of terms that are pertinent to Jeepform design. Okay, so an example scenario is Doubt, which was written in 2007 by Axelzon and Wrigstad. This is a LARP about, a freeform, I should say, about relationship difficulties between two actors in a romance that are on stage and off stage. So you have these two parallel sets of scenes happening alongside each other, and there are different levels of meta play happening. There's meta play between the players, there's meta play between the characters, and then there's also meta play between the stage characters that they're enacting. The game master can introduce flashbacks and dream sequences. So while the majority of the play is linear, there's also non-linear play that can be introduced. There are 4 players that are taking turns playing 2 different roles, and sometimes playing other roles in the fiction as well. So this is breaking that fidelity to character, where one person is playing one character. Instead, people are taking turns playing these characters. Players can choose several scenes together in the beginning that they plan to play, and those get listed by the GM. They discuss the details as a group, so they collaboratively decide on the story, very similar to story games in a lot of these scene negotiations that you see in tabletop. And the GM will then guide them through each of these scenes that they've chosen. And I wanted to give you a couple of quotes from Doubt. It says at the very beginning of this freeform, Doubt is a scenario about relations. It's about love, active and passive choices, about the death of romanticizing, and about the implicit contracts within relationships. Doubt is a game for players who know how to bring their own experiences and feelings in the mix and play their characters close to home. And close to home in this case, just as a side note, refers to playing a character that is very similar to your own experience in some way. They go on to say, you could say that Doubt by accident borders on psychodrama. Our goal is to discuss love and relationships, to toy with more or less electric everyday situations from your life, and role play about things that are close. We believe a good gaming experience is one way of getting there, but by no means the only one, or even a necessary one. If you feel you can get there by sacrificing the game experience, please do. So this is a very interesting thing to say at the start of a game. Not only are they comparing it to psychodrama, but they're insinuating here a transformative impact of some sort. They want to get you to a certain emotional experience so that you can have a certain amount of reflection about your life and perhaps communicate that with other people. And that kind of takes it a little bit out of this leisure context, which normally just emphasizes, oh, this will be a fun or rewarding experience, even if insights do occur. That's explicitly pointing to the kinds of impacts that it wants to have on the players. Okay, and lastly, I want to talk a little bit about Black Box Larp. Black Box Larp refers to role-playing that takes place in an environment that is identical or similar to a traditional theatrical black box. So basically, a black room with very minimal scenography or furniture, but with lighting and sound, and preferably it'll be bare. Black box has been used in several ways. It can refer to a short LARP that takes place in an actual theatrical black box. It can be a room within an existing LARP where players go to role play scenes. These scenes can take place in the past, the present, future. They can be dream sequences, and this is sometimes called a meta room. So while the rest of the LARP is happening at linear time, there's this meta room where other kinds of scenes can be explored. And sometimes that's called a black box. And these are facilitated often very similarly to freeform scenes, either amongst the players themselves or with an actual game master. And it can also refer to a much longer LARP, like a full-scale multiple day LARP that takes place in a black box setting for the dramatic impact of having the sound and the lights. Black box LARPs often are minimalistic with sparse costuming and props. Again, they include lights and sound in dramatic ways. They often include abstract or surreal representations of the themes, the time, the settings, the characters, and the relationships. So because there's very little physical things in the environment, then you have these abstract representations. And sometimes, as we'll see, it may feature unusual physicality and or vocalizations. So I'd like to talk a little bit about one of the most famous black box LARPs out there, which is White Death by Nina Rune Essendrop and Simon Steen Hansen. And this is a LARP about the human struggle during life and peace in death. And I'm quoting Kevin Burns here. who played the LARP in 2014. He says the story involves a group of people who decide to set out into the mountains to found a utopian community of some kind. Gradually, however, they all succumb to the elements and die. As they do so, they transform into the white ones, quote unquote, which are benevolent spirits free of human limitations. So it's a nonverbal LARP with restricted movements that are specific to each character. So players will have a certain restriction. For example, they can only move their body left to right. They can't move up to down. And that affects the way that they move through the entire session of play until they become white ones on the other side, their character dies, in which case their movement is free. It is also nonverbal, which means that they can only kind of communicate through nonverbal vocalizations, grunts and screams, that sort of thing. And also body language, of course. This game is very heavily workshopped in order to get players to get there. So there's much more actual workshop time leading into it than play. And in this workshop emphasizes physical movement and emphasizes interaction with each other rather than, say, creating character relations or going into a lot of story. There's hardly any story at all. One's character consists solely of their movement restriction, a bias that they have towards a couple of characters that they trust, and a prejudice that they have against some group of other people for completely arbitrary reasons. So, for example, not trusting anyone who has hair that's longer than yours. And then they're thrown into this world where they're playing without words and having to move in these strange ways. And so those biases and prejudices come out in their interactions. It features white balloons, cups of sugar, and sheets of paper as the only scenography or props. And these abstractly represent hope, sustenance, and faith, respectively. Now, how each character chooses to interact with these objects or not interact with them at all is up to them, but these are symbolic. And then loud music is played throughout the LARP through the sound system, and players can only communicate with their bodies and these nonverbal vocalizations, as I mentioned. So, how White Death subverts traditional LARP design, and even many other LARPs that are considered experimental. I mean, this is quite experimental. Physicality is limited, and this emphasizes the awkwardness and the struggle of the human experience, rather than engaging in physical acts of agility or heroism. Verbalization is limited, and this actually restricts players from one of their key human skills, which is communication. A lot of LARP is about talking, particularly in theater style LARP. And so that gets taken off the table, and then you have to find new ways of interacting and new ways of communicating. Plot, quote unquote, becomes irrelevant, as do any sort of mental activities that are related to play. So you're not doing a ton of thinking about the, tactics or, mechanics or story. You're actually just being really dropped in to the somatic, visceral experience of your body in a state of discomfort and struggle, and then shifting into comfort and ease, and basically dancing and having a physical freeing experience. In this LARP, losing is inevitable, so the emphasis is on the interactions at each present moment. Now, Nina's LARPs have become their own genre called Ninaform, its own tradition, if you will. And some of these games are designed by Essendrop, or they've been inspired by her LARPs. And again, they're mostly non-verbal or only a moderately verbal, physical, symbolic games that usually have deeply resonant elements of human experience in some way. Okay, so some takeaways. Experimental LARPs are avant-garde by nature and often escape any attempts at definition. So even the definitions that I provided today, those may change over time. They often subvert both traditional tabletop role-playing game and LARP design. They are making their way into more and more popular venues with hybrid games and hybrid experimental LARPs existing based on existing IPs. They can be about anything, the imagination is the limit, and they thrive best within a community of design and play. For example, the Knutepunkt Solmokota tradition in the Nordic countries, which is a conference that rotates, as well as Festival and Prologue and Ropacon and various other places where people go to play rather than just to talk about games. And another example is Metatopia in the US, which is a design conference. And then there's places where people can play associated with that design conference, such as Dreamation and DexCon. So, these LARPs don't just come out of nowhere. They come out of a group of people, a design community, and they are often supported and played within those communities, but are growing. Here are some of my references. And again, I'm Sarah Lynne Bowman from Uppsala University's Department of Game Design. Thank you so much for listening.